The impact of export controls on U.S. companies. It is well recognized that export controls can have an adverse effect on the implementer. Export controls deny affected firms in the implementing country economic opportunities that the market would otherwise allow. Thus, the United States must also consider the impact on U.S. firms when evaluating the outcomes of its semiconductor export control regime. As the export controls were announced relatively recently, there's only one prominent study released to date that quantifies their impact on the U.S. semiconductor industry, an April 2024 report released by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This memo draws on the conclusions of that report, along with additional information provided by industry experts. In broad terms, the economic impact of the export controls on the United States can be divided into three categories. Loss of revenue of U.S. firms. U.S. firms may lose revenue due to both the direct and indirect effects of the export controls. As a direct outcome of the export controls, U.S. firms are prohibited from selling specified products to targeted Chinese firms without a government-issued license. If denied a license, the U.S. firms must identify other buyers for their products, or else their sales revenue will decline. Available evidence suggests that affected U.S. firms are not identifying new buyers. The April 2024 report from the New York Fed found that affected U.S. firms are terminating relationships with targeted Chinese firms but are not forming new relationships with other firms. Indeed, the report found a statistically significant drop in revenue, profitability, bank credit, and employment in affected U.S. firms following the announcement of the export controls on October 7, 2022. As an indirect effect of the export controls, concerns of future restrictions may deter the formation of new commercial relationships between U.S. and foreign firms. For instance, the New York Fed's report found a chilling effect on commercial relationships between affected U.S. firms and Chinese firms not targeted by the export controls. It is safer to avoid these firms, rather than risk investing in a new relationship only for future restrictions to prohibit it. Further, the export controls may deter the formation of relationships between U.S. firms and firms in countries other than China for the same reasons. Rather than rely on U.S. firms over the long term, these third-party firms may prefer to identify sources of supply that are less likely to burden them with future restrictions. The New York Fed's report indicated this may be the case, as it found that affected U.S. firms were not establishing new relationships with firms located in allied nations either. The potential lost revenue could have a considerable impact on the U.S. semiconductor industry, as it undermines the economies of scale that the industry depends on. Given the huge upfront costs in semiconductor manufacturing, U.S. semiconductor firms spent nearly $50 billion on capital in 2022 alone. Firms must maximize their sales to recoup their investment and remain price competitive. The more goods a company produces and sells, the more its per-unit costs will be spread out and absorbed, allowing it to offer more competitive prices. Furthermore, that firm will also earn more revenue, giving it more money to invest in additional capital and R&D. Thus, as the export controls may directly or indirectly reduce sales to the Chinese market, they may undermine the competitiveness of U.S. firms. The potential impact could be quite large, as China is the largest semiconductor market in the world. In 2022, China accounted for 31.4% of all semiconductor purchases, with U.S. firms capturing 53.4% of the Chinese market. In a worst-case scenario, this could lead to a death spiral, where export controls reduce U.S. firm competitiveness and revenue, which leads to less money to invest in R&D and capital, which further reduces competitiveness and revenue, which leads to less money to invest in R&D and capital, and so on. Notably, however, the New York Fed's report found that capital expenditures by affected U.S. firms have remained stable, suggesting that the export controls have yet to impact certain long-term investment plans. A report from Silverado Policy Accelerator also found that U.S. SME exports to China fell from $6.4 billion in 2022 to $5.9 billion in 2023. A modest drop that may reflect Chinese firms buying more mature, non-controlled technologies in larger numbers. Loss of stock market capitalization of U.S. companies. As the export controls restrict operations and introduce uncertainty into the U.S. semiconductor industry, the announcement of the export controls resulted in a loss of stock market capitalization for U.S. semiconductor firms. The PHLX Semiconductor Sector Index, a market cap-weighted index of the 30 largest U.S. semiconductor companies, fell 8% following the October 2022 announcement and 3% following the October 2023 updates, although the index subsequently recovered. The April 2024 report by the New York Fed determined that the announcement of the semiconductor export controls on October 7, 2022, was followed by a 2.5% drop in stock market valuation for affected U.S. semiconductor firms that persisted for at least 20 days. This drop translates to an aggregate decrease in market capitalization of $130 billion for the affected U.S. firms.